was really good. I like your priority about responsibility sharing instead of burden sharing. You need both, because responsibilities are followed by money. So, but the priority is right. First, let's talk about responsibilities, and then talk about capabilities and burden sharing. So money is not a worth in itself, but it has a serving function for duties and responsibilities. So I like that very much. Now, Anna, and to others, we were very keen to make not a long report. We wanted to end with 50 pages. This was the limit, I think, from Mellon Albright. And we ended with 67 or 68 or so. So this was decision number one, not too long reports. Secondly, we wanted to make a strong analysis, but not a long one. We are not asked to make textbooks. So I think the relation between analysis and recommendations is, I would say, well, 30 to 70 or 20 to 80 or so, and this is exactly what we wanted. If we read all these papers from think tanks, it's normally the other way. 70-80% excellent analysis, and then some poor recommendations at the end. So we wanted it just to make the opposite. So sorry that some analysis perhaps is not founded enough, and this is an answer for others as well. We didn't mention all the missions. We didn't mention all the countries. We wanted to avoid fingerprinting on some allies. So if you can read, you can understand, but we definitely didn't want to mention, except of America and Europe, some countries within the alliance. So this was the reason for doing that. And then, Anna, we discussed the NATO-China Council. I don't know if it was your proposal, others mentioned as well, and we said no. It's a formalism. The NATO-Russian Council is not a real good model, but we recommended to consider to build a special body. We didn't mention it, perhaps a council, not a council with China, but perhaps a council on China or another special body. At least an instrument or a body where you concentrate all the discussions about China from all aspects, from all the committees, but not at this stage, at least, a NATO-China Council. And then, of course, we discussed the issues about missions or activities in the Indo-Pacific area, freedom of movement and things like that. But we said, and I think the Czech General made it very clear, we are a transatlantic defense alliance. We are not the world police for every conflict in the world. So we have to have a 360 degrees perspective, but our action are more or less founded on the transatlantic area. So we didn't put it in the report, but the mainstream was think global and act transatlantic, perhaps with an exception on fighting terrorism under special conditions, but not more. But of course, a strategic partnership with countries in that area allows us to at least have information sharing or so, but not in the way, it's a slippery road to talk about actions in this area there. So and I think Iran, we didn't mention Iran. In a way, it's put in our chapter, arms control and deterrence. We in the main findings, if you look at that, we couldn't mention all our recommendations, all the chapters, but if you mention everything, you don't prioritize. So this was the way how we prioritized, and this is not everything. These are my tough answers.
Thank you very much. And point taken on think tanks doing a little too much analysis. Wes, would you like to also respond to these a wide range of issues, including the points made by Alexandra and Anna earlier.
Certainly, I would welcome that, and I'll try to economize my comments. A lot was said, and I agree with the vast majority of it, but maybe just hit a few of the points briefly. First of all, I want to say I very much agree with Alexandra, particularly her comment about strategic simultaneity. And I think what we have to capture, or what we tried to capture in the report, is not just the traditional NATO emphasis on 360 degrees, which suggests a kind of two azimuths, or look at all horizons at once, and almost respond reactively, or you look in all directions. In some ways, it conveys the opposite of prioritization. What we mean by strategic simultaneity is sustained pressure from two very large, purposeful military actors that have the large capabilities of large states. And that will require, at times, maybe strategic sequencing, various things, but certainly not just reacting to things as they emerge. And that's part of what we wanted to get at about the environment that NATO is increasingly in, or is moving into. And so I substantially agree with what Alexandra has said, and I would just underline that, because I think it's a leitmotif of the report that should be grasped. To Anna, I want to pick up on Thomas's point briefly about the NATO-China Council, because it's an important one. Our group did debate that at length, and I think there were many reasons why we didn't embrace it, but I would underscore one, because I think it's the most important, and it is that you first have to have the ability to consult about China before you can contemplate reasonably having a constructive consultation with China. And the view of the group is that NATO really is just at the starting point of beginning to get its head around the China issue, of converging on the bigger political questions of China, which one of the YouTube questioners has raised. And so I think we believe there is a fundamental discussion within NATO that's needed about how to characterize China and how to develop tools for dealing with China. And then, and only then, would an attempt at a structured dialogue with China have any chance of being productive, because it, in a sense, a productive political dialogue is a derivative of a deeper political will and strategy that we believe it still needs to be formed. And then maybe just briefly, each of the three comments or questions that I heard from viewers, thank you all for those. I thought they were very smart questions. Just briefly on the first question about splits among allies on Beijing. Of course, to some extent that's true, but I would note a couple things. One is it's very fluid, and in fact, I think we already see convergence on key dimensions of the China challenge. We're in a different place in US-Europe discussions about China now than we were a year ago, or certainly 4 or 5 years ago. And I think in some ways, COVID and Chinese diplomatic and military behavior of the last several months has acted as an accelerant to a US-European convergence. I'm not going to say that we see completely eye to eye, but even in the deliberations of our group and with allies and experts, I have to say, there was not a deeply contentious debate within our group about China. I think there's an awareness on the basis of Chinese behavior of the challenge. And indeed, ultimately, we're asked to look out to 2030. And so hopefully what our recommendations will provide is both an example of how US-Europe convergence is possible, but also in the substance of those recommendations, they are meant themselves to aid in a convergence on China, which is, of course, an inherently political act. On the Mediterranean question, Operation Sea Guardian, I don't in any way downplay the importance of that operation, but I would just underscore again, we were asked to look out to 2030, and we were asked to emphasize the political dimension of the NATO alliance. And so there were certain things that were pressing in the headlines, or that are important intrinsically, but were just beyond the remit of what we were asked to look at. And it's a similar answer in part on the third question. I heard a couple of questions from the third individual, but let me just pick up on what Thomas has said about some of the concerns about dynamics of human rights or democracy within NATO allies. I would just recall that the mission or the task of our effort was to provide recommendations for strengthening NATO political cohesion, again, out to 2030. The report deliberately does not mention allies by name, and that's true both whether it's of allies in Europe that there have been criticisms of, or the United States. Of course, we were aware of a lot of those dynamics. We weren't ignorant of them. But I think in a report like this, it's crucial that we be able to not talk about these issues in a way that the report itself becomes an implement of political of weakening political cohesion, or giving wedges or openings, even in messaging, that the Russians and Chinese or others could exploit. And finally, I would just point out, I think there are, in fact, quite candid recommendations in the report that are describing many of the most challenging internal dynamics of NATO today. We didn't dodge them at all. I think we handled them professionally and in a balanced way. So we talk about the questions of democratic governance and make several recommendations, disputes between members, the saliency of single country blockages or allies developing military technological relationships with rivals, or transatlantic tensions. We didn't dodge any of these. We weren't shy about any of them, but I think we wanted to provide recommendations that would actually increase cohesion rather than potentially inadvertently weaken it. So thanks again for those questions. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Alexandra and Anna, I'd like to invite you, and then I have 3 more very good questions. So let's make sure we have time to answer those as well.
Very quickly on the China question. The person who asked the question is right to say that we are not unified in qualifying China as a military threat in Europe. Most European partners still see China through the mainly economic lens. And that's a criticism that we are often confronted to when we are talking with American colleagues. There are two countries in Europe who have a military presence in the Indo-Pacific and a military strategy, France and the UK, and that's basically it. And this is where there is also a lot of cooperation between these 3 countries, between UK, France, and the United States in the Indo-Pacific. But I would say maybe a longer-term lesson from the COVID-19 crisis is that this will also lead more Europeans to realize that our over-reliance on China on many critical aspects, not only medical, but also digital and others, might have longer-term strategic and even military implications for Europe. And there I include also, the military mobility issue that was mentioned in the report. And this again leads me, to the idea of simultaneity, where everything is linked. Then I want to focus on the southern flank, because I want to link also the comment to Sinan Ulgen's question, which just arrived, because he's asking, had Turkey demonstrated willingness to engage in a strategic political dialogue with the NATO about Syria and Libya, would that have received the backing of all allies, including France? Yes, of course. I think here what we are facing is, a troubling situation where the domestic politics is increasingly having an impact on foreign policy orientations of a few of NATO's member states. And that needs to be factored in much more. The other thing I wanted to point is that we've seen very recently a change in the American tone vis-à-vis Turkey. And there again, I think that the way the new Biden administration will position itself on the Turkey question will also be extremely decisive. And lastly, on Libya, on Iraq, on Syria, we have to be very clear that we cannot escape from talking and including Turkey when we are talking of the issues in NATO circles, because they are part of the setting of the situation. And so I think we should avoid, falling in what I would call the trap of le fait accompli, and really have much more direct conversation among allies, because Turkey is a member of NATO. And if we cannot have conversations even frank and directly and open among allies within the NATO framework, then I wonder, how we can use NATO if it's not done to address these, sometimes hard questions among allies. And that to me should be, I would say, a natural element and part of what we should be doing among allies, including in difficult situations such as this one.
Thank you very much. Anna?
Thank you. Yes, well, there was a question on what to do with the Chinese investments that have already been made on infrastructure and so on in Europe. I think that's a great question. I think it's far-fetched to think that we would just nationalize and throw them out. I don't, it doesn't seem like the European way of doing it. But the foreign investment screening mechanisms that are just being built up, I think, will actually be very useful in changing the way and making us consider these aspects better in Europe in a way that we haven't done before. We just had Sweden recently screening or scrutinizing itself whether Huawei should be part of the 5G network buildup, and actually there was a no to that, which is a pretty bold decision for a mid-sized country. But that was purely out of security concern. That's what that would bring. So I think that's pretty interesting, and it wouldn't be possible a few years ago if you didn't have that kind of thinking of what does this actually imply. And I think this will make us move forward pretty fast on these issues, I hope. And that brings me perhaps back to the NATO-China Council, just to say that I agree completely on that. I mean, I think it's a valid point that we need to have a common ground first in order to be able to have a position of strength, to have a dialogue with China. But if you look at 2030, I think really we need to develop also the dialogue paths with China in a coherent way. And hopefully we have a much more of a solid ground together to stand on by then.
Thank you very much. I have quite a few questions here in the chat, so I'm going to try and synthesize them rather than read them out. So I have a question from Owen Lagadek on any lessons drawn from the 2010 group of experts report on how to implement the findings by NATO. I mean, of course, those are political decisions. I'd also just mention that Alexandra and Anna also responded to some of the questions in the chat, one about Chinese investments and the other about Syria and Libyan dialogue with Turkey. Then we have a question from Georgia, which I'm very glad to have. Post-Cold War, NATO is all about enlarging, and what are the prospects for strengthening NATO's cooperation with countries such as Georgia and Ukraine, which are both mentioned in the report. And then we have a question, a comment through Twitter about how NATO has shown joint and operational level superiority, but at the strategic level, we have seen a lot of uncertainty. And how can NATO improve its strategic level problems when it has to take rapid actions against rival actors such as China, Russia, etc. And then finally, a question. So it's about political decision making and deployment. Question from Sven Schwerzensky. Is strategic simultaneity not going to shadow divergences and contradictions between Russia and China for NATO to engage in a differentiated way, also making good of such differences for NATO? This one I did read out. So I'd go back to our speakers. I think we'll just stick to the same order. We have 10 minutes, so I suppose you can have 2 minutes each, 2.5 minutes each. And please, Thomas, the screen is yours.
Yes, very, very shortly on China again. I appreciate the critical tone of the questions. How can we have a strategy on China when we don't have the same opinion, same analysis, and so on and so forth? The answer is it's exactly because of that we recommend a strategic and open discussion within NATO about China. So this is important. You cannot only have discussions when the outcome is clear. So our fundamental recommendation is use NATO as a forum for common security interests. And on China, there is a common interest. How to deal with that? And the preconditions cannot be same analysis, perhaps the outcome, but to discuss it. This is exactly the reason why we want a strategic approach on all the China issues. And for example, on infrastructure, it's the same. What we recommend is that you have a discussion on vulnerabilities. Where is NATO vulnerable because of China's activities? For example, on infrastructure, on harbors, on ports, and so on and so forth. And first you have information sharing, common analysis, and then perhaps you come to common actions or to common opinions, common statements. But you should not avoid it because in the starting point you don't have the same opinion. And then we don't overestimate the role of a strategic concept. That's true. It's written in our report. Strategic concept is not a panacea, but it helps, and the discussion itself helps. We recommend strictly and short time schedule to do so, ideally in 1 year, perhaps 2 years, not more. And the debate should not be an excuse not to change other things. But at least it's a good starting point for all of us, for all the NATO members, for all the allies, for the public to see that when international situation is changing, then NATO has to change his analysis, his strategy as well. And then the question on decision-making in crisis, absolutely true. Very good question. We made a recommendation there to, especially in crisis, to have quicker decision-making processes. We've heard and we learned, of course, that when it was really important after 9/11, the decision was made in 24 hours. That's true, and that was helpful and a good model. But perhaps we have crisis not as important as that. So there is a recommendation there as well. So to finish my remarks, I have the impression that some of the critical tone of the questions on our report is that there is not enough cohesion in NATO. But that's true. But our mandate was to overcome it, at least to address it, and with some implementations or recommendations to solve those problems on cohesion and solidarity and the lack of consultations. Over.
Thank you very much. And Wes, I'm asking you because Georgia was probably one of the countries that you were dealing with when you were Assistant Secretary of State. So maybe you could also address that.
Certainly. It's a crucial question. And by the way, I thought all the questions were good. Yeah. Let me be brief and try to start with that one. That, I think the group saw the report in a way as an opportunity for clarity on NATO's orientation towards its Eastern partners on a couple of levels. One, I think both in tone and substance, the report is very clear in affirming the open door policy, the Western prospects and path of Ukraine and Georgia, and of course in saying that NATO allies should substantially support vulnerable democracies like those that are under pressure from Russia internally and externally. And the second thing I want to stress, and I think this gets at the heart of the question, is the report is constructively critical of how NATO currently manages its partnerships, including its Eastern partnerships, that these are tremendously valuable tools, but they've also grown up or evolved in a sort of laminous fashion since the Cold War in almost greenhouse conditions that didn't always impose a lot of rigor in how we utilize partnerships. And the result is that today you have partnerships at NATO, and you can think, for example, the partnership with Ukraine or Georgia, where the priorities and activities of those partnerships actually come about because of demand signals from the partners themselves, as opposed to coming from NATO. And you have very sporadic funding streams for these partnerships. There's no steady funding base, really. It's primarily voluntarily funded by allies who care about specific partnerships. And all of that, I think, lends itself to a somewhat non-strategic use of partnerships. So the report says, in essence, in an era of sharpened strategic competition, you need to be strategic about how you utilize partnerships, and you need a strategic blueprint. So if you want to strengthen the partnership with Georgia and Ukraine, you start by having a more systematic and strategic approach to how you're funding your partnerships, how you're utilizing them, and how you're communicating that to partners. I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'll not give my responses to everything else that was said. I think I'll just restrict it to one other, and that is the comment that was made. I think it was the third question or comment, how to improve the strategic level abilities of NATO under tactical stress, as I understood the question. And this is a crucial point, and I'm glad that someone has picked up on it, because the report really stresses developing tools that in some cases don't exist in NATO at present to better take in that strategic view and to more proactively mitigate differentials in threat assessment. So we talk, for example, about a net assessment unit. We talk in the report about, obviously, as Thomas said, a new strategic concept that would outline the big strategic priorities of the alliance. But we also talk about a sort of purposefully returning a culture of strategy and strategic thinking to NATO that in some ways I think we've gotten away from. It's not a criticism, it's just an observation. Since the end of the Cold War, we have had more of a crisis management environment, and I think that shows, and that's a lot of what the report tries to address. Over.
Thank you very much. Alexandra.
Yeah, very quickly. On the decision-making process, one proposal which I found was really interesting and I suppose easy to implement was the one on having NATO being able to create a more structured mechanism to support the establishment of coalitions inside existing alliance structures. And this basically would enable allies to bring new operations under a NATO chapeau, even when not all allies may wish to participate in any resulting mission. And that, again, I thought was a pragmatic approach. Also, if there is a need for a quick response in a certain type of crisis, but having NATO playing this framework for coalitions of the willing or of the able, as you want to call it, when you need to have a quick action and not all allies agree on having a NATO mission. Now, the other question on Russia, China, how do we deal with these challenges? Yes, these are not the same challenges, but they require, if I can say, quite similar approaches, which is that it puts us Europeans, Americans, NATO allies in a sort of uncomfortable situation where obviously we will need to compartmentalize our relationship with these powers, which means that we will need, on the one hand, to confront China and Russia on certain issues, and the other hand, we will need to keep the dialogue and cooperation open on other issues. And from my understanding, the Biden administration is very much in that approach, not willing to be in a 100% confrontational approach either with China or Russia, but finding ways of finding this equilibrium or difficult balance between dialogue and confronting on the other hand. And that's, I would say, is probably the most complex relationships to define because it requires differentiated style of cooperation and confrontation on the other side. And I don't see any other solution than just going through that sort of duality in both relationship with both powers.
Thank you. Anna?
Thank you. I will just comment very briefly on the partnerships. I think it's a very good and valid point that it needs to be much more interest-driven. Sweden and Finland are singled out in the report also and set as examples for others, and that has been the key, actually. The alliance and Sweden and Finland agreeing on that it's better for the defense of the Baltics if you also cooperate closely and develop the partnership in that regard, how to do those things. And that has been lacking with Georgia. I think one key issue for Georgia will be, there's been no movement on Russia with regard to Georgia and the position of NATO in this regard. the diplomatic efforts also to solve the situation of the occupied territories in Georgia. You need to move ahead in some direction there in order also to have a more of a long-term idea of what to do with the partnerships with Georgia and Ukraine, since they both want to be members of NATO, and you have an open door policy. You need to solve all those issues and then move ahead also with the partnership development, in my view.
Thank you very much, Anna. And we need to bring this discussion to a close with some regrets, because I think this has been a discussion that's been very wide-ranging, but also very focused. And it's quite extraordinary to combine this in such a short period of time. We've also had some very good questions from our audience, so thank you all for that. I would just like to make two very brief additional remarks. The first is that I think this report demonstrates yet again the value of expertise. The report dives into analysis, it dives into strategy, and it tries to make the findings and the recommendations adaptable to the real world. And I think this underscores, from my point of view, and I confess a vested professional interest in the value of expertise. It's important to engage with the expert communities. It's important to have fact-based recommendations that can drive political decisions, and it's not just ideology that is driving them. And the second point that I'd like to make, which comes up in the report, perhaps less so during the context of the discussion, but the reiteration of the importance of values, the community of values, and of democracy. And we're witnessing a change in narrative these days, and we need to see whether this narrative will actually be followed up through political practice, in the sense that it's not just NATO that needs to adapt its capabilities to a changing security environment. It's also that our democratic structures, our procedures, our principles need to be adapted and upgraded and improved to adjust to the new strategic environment. So these are my additional points. They're slightly, they're footnotes, shall we say, but for me, it's a takeaway from this discussion and from reading the report. I would like to thank all our panelists for joining us today. I would like to thank the 10 independent experts who worked on this project for the past 6 months. I'm sure they'll be able to participate in other events. For this particular one, it was the co-chairs representing the whole group. I'd like to thank the audience, of course, for staying with us and for asking such pertinent and sometimes challenging questions, which everybody appreciated. And last but not least, I'd like to thank my colleagues at Carnegie for putting this together. It's been really, there's been a lot of work behind the scenes that none of you can see, and also our friends at NATO for partnering with Carnegie on this specific event. So without further ado, I would like to bring this discussion to an end, and thank you all for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. Oh, you were brilliant, both of you. Oh, Alexandra as well, who's gone. Thanks.
Thank you so much, and thanks. Great discussion. Well moderated.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Leave.
I don't know where to end.
Leave studio at the bottom, yeah.